Let's go on actually to the third one. Because I'm going to introduce myself, I also introduce my community. I'm Nancy White in Seattle, Washington, where the sun isn't quite risen yet. I just looked out the window to check. And I've been interested in how people interact online since about 1996 when I fell down the online interaction rabbit hole in Howard Reingold's Electric Minds community. And I've been fascinated by when things work really well with people online and when they go really badly, and trying to understand how we can shift more to the successful side. What are the practices, the warm electronic human practices that we can do to be better communicators, interactors, workers, players, doers online? In 2004, after much resistance, I decided to blog, and it was actually my third attempt at blogging because the first two, it never took. People didn't interact with me. It felt like there's this singular blah, blah, blah out to the world. I didn't need a platform for publishing. I needed a platform for connecting. So I started again in 2004 after a pretty interesting engagement with a bunch of bloggers at an event that some of us put on in the California Bay Area called TechMod. In fact, Stowe Boyd, who's one of your speakers there, was one of the folks who attended. I met him there for the first time. And what struck me when we did this sort of ad hoc social network analysis exercise with the group was that the blog-based community had very intimate ties with each other. They were very connected. The forum-based people, they were all in different forums. And so some of them knew each other, but they didn't have the connection across their sub-communities that the blog-based people did. And I was very taken aback by that because I've been in really significant community relationships over time in space and forum-based communities. But this was something new, so I started blogging in 2004. In 2005, I started reading the blog of Lilia Efimova, who spoke this morning with you. And through our connections, she was at a conference in Seattle. We met, and I heard she was going to be coming to Seattle all that next summer to do an internship at Microsoft. And I said, look, when you get here, why don't you stay in my house with you while so you can figure out where to stay? Well, Lily ended up staying the whole summer. We ended up having lots of conversations around the breakfast table, eating lots of blueberries and raspberries, about this thing about how people connect between blogs. Next slide, please. Lily had been doing some thinking about the social ecosystem, about how people got to know each other by reading each other rather than, having conversations about each other. Next slide, please. How linking became a form of personal recommendation. So if I linked to you, I was therefore stating in some way that I have a relationship with you in some way. Next slide, please. That these aggregated into what she called distributed conversations. And next slide, please. Are you keeping pace with me, Pedro?
I'm on slide 6.
Perfect, thank you. Now, she go on to 7. I fly through some of these slides, which is fun. Oh, look at that, I can see the slides. This is collaboration in action, guys. We walk our talk, we improvise, we figure out how to make it happen. So this cloud that Lilia started drawing around with the little tribal people became something that I've been really interested in and really focusing on. What is it that creates a move from just simply a bunch of connected points to a community? So go on to the next slide from that one. Yeah, so what is this? What is the cloud? How does that become something significant for us as we think about each other and our relationship with each other? Okay, next slide. So this becomes the question, what about blog-based communities? When you say community, can you say blog in the same breath with a meaningful connection? And that's what I'd like to talk with you about today. Next slide, please. Just a quick diversion about what I am thinking about in terms of definition of community. Now, this lovely gentleman is the Fremont Troll. Fremont is what we call our artsy-fartsy neighborhood in Seattle. It's traditionally a home of a lot of creative, somewhat anarchic, often very liberal people. And there was a space underneath the Freeway Bridge that was really being used as a dumping ground, a drug exchange. And the community said, this is our space. We want to make it productive and meaningful for our community. So they built the troll. They didn't ask permission. They built the troll. You can see underneath the hand by the little kid here, that's an actual Volkswagen. So that gives you the size a sense of the dimension that these people created. And next slide, please. So they took what was their space and made it their space. So when we think about the blogosphere, our blog and the blogs we're connected in, how do we make it our space so that it belongs to our community? Or is belonging to our community even a useful concept? So here's some of the questions that I started with when I began my inquiry into blog-based communities. So what makes it a community? What's the relationship between the core and the periphery? And in this case, the author of a blog, the reader, or the commenter. It's an interesting dynamic, and I'm wondering how do I compare it to my other knowledge or meaning making of the community? How is individual and shared identity manifest? And how do boundaries shift? Because with a forum-based community, you knew the boundary. It was the login. And all of a sudden, it was different. So lots of interesting things to explore. Next slide, please. So as I started looking at these things, I started to think, are there patterns here that help me understand these boundaries? Can the space be a way to look at and define a blog-based community? And I noticed 3 different patterns. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to stop and take a sip of tea because I've got a little bit of a cold and my throat just all of a sudden said, I need some water. Cheers.
Cheers.
Do you guys have something to drink out there? Does everybody have everything they need?
No,
This is the kind of, the Italian moment in me, I just have to do that, you know? If I could, I'd pass out chocolate, as many of you know, and if I had really been prepared, I would have asked Beth to bring chocolate to share with you, because one of my important online identities is chocolate Nancy.
Okay, let's see.
Okay. Okay. It's really interesting to see my face over the slide, I gotta tell you, it's really weird. So one blog, one blogger is a very familiar form. It is where we started from. So somebody starts a blog and they start having people paying attention to them. They're in your face. Next slide, please. The kind of space model is hub and spoke. Hub and spoke. No smoking. Well, some people may smoke, but this is hub and spoke. So the cool blogger, the central figure, is in the middle. Their readers and commenters are around them. Now, these communities can become more interestingly complex over time. As you see the little purple bubbles, the readers who might be reading very closely, well, this is an example of the challenges of hub and spoke models, and is an art. So let's move along. Next, we're going to move to the next slides really fast. So these are some examples of the hub and spoke bloggers that you're familiar with. Next slide. The people who are in the top 10 of Technorati list right now, people who are highly linked to. Next slide. And we'll just spin through those screenshots. There's one in China. The next one, please. Beppe in Italy, David Koss in the US, Engadget, which tends to be number 1 very often in Technorati linking. Now, okay, stop there. These hub and spoke models, as I said, sometimes develop into a more network-like model, and then moves on to the second model, the topic-centric model. And this is a model where it's not the person who distinctly connects the community, but it's the topic. So it's a bunch of people who are blogging on similar topics or the same topic. They discover each other, they start cross-linking with each other, and the conversational flow starts being within that set of blogs. So an example are the PhD bloggers, and they're all kind of ends up supporting each other as they work on their PhDs and are blogging about doing their PhDs. So it's both a community of and about the domain of doing a PhD. Next slide, please. What happens in these ones, in this topic centric, is they can expand, they can scale out, because there's things happening on many blogs. They can rise and fall, not on a single blog, but on a collection of blogs. The power is more spread apart. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The space differences start showing up power differences. So when you think about the single blogger, they have all the power. They can turn off or on comments. They can delete comments. If they stop blogging, they delete their blog. But in a topic-centric blog, the power starts getting distributed. It's a different dynamic, and the community nature is different. Next slide, please. An example of this is Lee and Sacha Lefevre are going around the world, and they're blogging about their entire entire trip on a site called The World Is Not Flat. And Lee was in, I believe it was Vietnam, and he goes into a bar and there's some other Westerners in there. The guy looks at Lee and goes like, "You're Lee with fever." Lee goes, "Yeah." And it turns out they're both travel bloggers who've been reading each other's blog, and they ran into each other. This is this kind of looser connection, but it's amazing that they can be so widely spread. It's a big net versus a small net. Next slide, please. Another example is Global Voices, which is starting to be starting to be a hybrid between a series of connected blogs plus a hub in the middle. And all these individual bloggers blog on their own, but they belong to this community which supports bloggers in countries where there's not as much mainstream press coverage. So they're trying to get more coverage by highlighting bloggers and also protecting bloggers from blogging in dangerous situations. Next slide, please. Pedro, I'm doing a time check since we started. Do I still need to end at 1/2 the hour?
We still have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. So we're going to compress 30 minutes into 15.
No.
Okay. So okay. So the third form then that the Global Voices start to suggest is a boundary community. And this actually harkens back a little bit to our forum-based community, where all the bloggers sit on one platform offered by some host. And there may be forums or wikis and directories. There may be social networking tools, but all the blogs are right there. So we're squished up against each other a little bit more. There's proximity starts showing up in a forum. Next slide, please. The social networking tools may augment the relationship building that happens between blogs. The discussions in forums may do that. Next slide, please. I'm flying now. A good example of this is the Share Your Story site, which is a community for parents who've had babies in the neonatal intensive care unit. It's based in the U.S., but there's global members. Next slide, please. We started with forums and then added blogs, and we're really concerned that it would dilute the forum discussions or confuse people, but in fact, there was huge adoption of the blogs. People knew what to do where. The forums ended up being the topic of discussions, like, how long is your baby on a ventilator? And the blogs ended up being their personal stories, the photos of their kids. And this quote by one of our key members was, "We can blog to vent, we can blog to declare some breaking news, we can blog just to babble." It gave them permission to do that, where in the forums they didn't feel like they felt like they were taking up too much community space to do that. So in this kind of ecosystem of tools, there's a really incredibly strong community. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a link at the end where I've looked at some of the differences and similarities between these forums in terms of power, in terms of technical architecture. Next slide, please. In terms of social architecture. Next slide, please. In terms of content and domain. And of course, these things are too small to see on the screen. But I wanted to share the snapshot here is to think about how do we have friends to look at blog-based communities so that they'll be useful to us when we want to try and use blog communities for particular actions. So this is not just hypothesizing. It's like, what if someone says, I want to have a blog-based community of teachers. I want to have a blog-based community of my scientific researchers. What do we need to know about these forums that would inform how we're going to structure those communities? Would we suggest group blogging? Would we suggest a boundary? Would we suggest a network or a single blogger? These are all things that help us inform our choices of technology and practices. Next slide, please. But boundary formation through technology is not the only way to describe these communities. So I'd like to say that at the end of this short introduction to the kind of boundary way of doing it, here's some other ways of looking at it. Next slide, please. We can look at it from a genre perspective. What is the topic? What is the purpose? And how does that impact? And it does. It's not just about the technical formation. Next slide, please. We can look at it from a network perspective. There's been a lot of interesting posts by a group of edubloggers who were gathered in New Zealand. Some of it has been posted by Stephen Downs about the difference between groups and networks. And I don't agree with everything they're posting because I think we're creating artificial boundaries. But clearly blogging lends itself to network formation, so we need to think about that role. And Ben Remington has a great article on the ODI website, that the URL is there for later, that talks about the functions of networks. And there's some really applicable things to look at blog-based communities with it. Next slide, please. We're almost there. Finally, Fox and Parker's work on social network analysis and types can be used to look at actors within a blog-based community, but it can also be looked at in terms of the type of blog, or has a blog portray some of these actors as central connectors, unsung heroes, bottlenecks, etc. So there's lots of different ways we can look at these blog-based communities, and it's very practical. Next slide, please. Of course, there's tons of other questions. I'm not going to dump them all on your head. Well, I am going to dump them all on your head. But just as food for thought into the future. And next slide, please. I want to let you know that there are resources. There's an article that I recently wrote that was published in Australia about this topic, and my contact information that you can distribute with your conference materials online or whatever. But go back one slide, please, Pedro, to the other questions. And let me stop here and invite your questions.
Okay.
Was that fast enough?
Yes, let's take some.